Hi, this is Malcolm Groves. In this session is going to be the first in hopefully a few sessions where I dive into object relational mapping in Delphi and C++ Builder. If you're not familiar with object relational mapping or why you might be interested in it, I will give a quick overview, but mostly in this session, in today's session, I want to spend the time in code actually showing you how you would start to do this. But we'll get to that in a second. First off, if you think about how people have built database applications with Delphi in the past, typically or normally people use data-aware controls, grids and edit boxes and other user interface elements, and they use queries and table components and then connect through the database. And the developer is responsible for creating the database usually, or a DBA or somebody, but basically the developer writes the SQL query that they want to write to pull back the records, and then writes the code in their form or in their data module that iterates over those records and does something with them. Yeah, and then you connect it up with a data source into a grid or whatever. Yeah, that's been a very common way of working with Delphi since Delphi 1. Yeah. Over the years, though, people have wanted to do more work with objects, business objects, rather than with just records in a database. They want to have a customer object rather than just a record in a customer table. And so they've created those customer objects and other business-related objects. But then it's their job to save the data in those objects into the database somewhere, customer table or wherever else. And also their job to load it up, create a customer and load the values into that object from the database. Yeah. So there's a bunch of time spent sort of doing this plumbing work of saving and loading objects into the database, all so that they can interact with them as objects. Yeah, and for some people that's been worth the effort, but then they're also then left with an effort to bind it into the user interface. And now live bindings in recent versions of Delphi has made that a lot easier. So you can bind directly from your UI into your business objects, but traditionally it's been difficult because you've got data-aware controls. They're not object-aware controls, they're database-aware controls. Yeah? So this is where object relational mapping has started to come in to try and ease the burden of saving and loading those business objects into the database, and in some cases also try to help with the binding layer between the business objects and the form. Yeah? Now, I know a number of people who've done this over the years in systems, and it has meant in a lot of cases, a lot of plumbing work, a lot of extra work, and in a lot of cases they give up some of the productivity benefits of RAD, but they do it with the view that long-term the maintainability of their application it'll be easier to maintain, and they'll get that productivity back in the long term. Yeah. Short term it might take them a bit longer, but long term they'll win. I've been using a product from TMS called Aurelius, which is an object relational mapper for Delphi and C Builder. And one of the things I've been really impressed about Aurelius is that it's very sophisticated. There's a lot of depth to the product. But but they've done a really good job, I think, of making the introduction to it quite gentle. You can kind of start using it without having to know a whole bunch and without having to learn a whole bunch, and then gradually, as you need to access more of those capabilities, you can learn the bits you need. It's a very gradual, gentle learning curve, yeah. But at the same time, it's very powerful, yeah. So that's what I want to go through in this first session. In the later sessions, we'll go much deeper into some of that sophistication and depth in the product. But in this first session, I basically just want to show you in a live coding exercise how quickly you can set up Aurelius inside a brand new application, create some objects, start saving them to a database and querying the database to load them back up again. We'll make the object model a little bit richer and see how we can update the database to react to that. And then we'll also do some basic binding into data-aware controls. Later on, I'll look at using live bindings. But for this session, we'll probably end with using some traditional data-aware controls to represent that data. Yeah. What I have here, if we look, I've got a VCL application. Aurelius uses FireMonkey as well, works with FireMonkey as well, and it works across all the FireMonkey platforms, so mobile and desktop. But in this case, I'm just using VCL. I've got a main form, which is mostly empty, and I've got a data module. And the data module is almost empty, except it has a FireDAC connection off to my database. Now, the database that I'm using in this case is Interbase, and I've got a CRM database that's empty. You can see it's got no tables in it at the moment. So the scenario I'm going to create for this example is a basic customers, contacts, orders kind of application. As we go through the various sessions, the data model will get richer. Yeah. So I'm using FireDAC and Interbase, but you don't have to. Aurelius supports pretty much every data access technology for Delphi. If it doesn't support one, I'll be surprised because the list is pretty long. And then within those, it supports a whole bunch of different databases. So if you're not using Interbase, if you're not using FireDAC, it doesn't matter. You can still leverage Aurelius. Okay. So I've got an Interbase database. I've got a form and a data module, and that's pretty much all I've got at the moment. What I have done though is you can see I've added some of the Aurelius units to the users clause just to make things a little bit easier, but I'll try and call out which ones I've added and why I've added them as we go. Yeah. The other thing that I've got set up in here is I've just added a FireDAC monitoring component, and I've set it up to do tracing just on command executions. Because I also want to be able to have a look in my, in my FireDAC monitor. I want to be able to look at what SQL Aurelius is executing for me under the covers when I save a database. Oh, sorry, when I save an object or when I load an object, yeah. So that's why I've got that guy set up. And I think from memory, I've already set up the connection to do monitoring. Yeah, here we go. It's doing remote monitoring, yeah. But otherwise, the application is largely empty. Okay, so let's go through and have a look at what we need to do. Now, there are a couple of things, initial concepts that you need to know, excuse me, when you're using Aurelius. First one is about how Aurelius connects to the database, because it can use a whole bunch of different data access technologies. We need to give it a connect. We need to basically tell it what connection to use and what type of connection it is. Now, for this, it wants a. We have to set up a thing called an object called a database manager. Yeah. So you can create an instance of a database manager however you like. It's up to you. I like to set it up as a property on my data module, just to make it, to sort of keep it with all of the database related stuff. so that if later on I want to change and use a different sort of database, not use FireDAC, not use Interbase, then all my database related things are in one place. Yeah. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to create a property on my data module here called DB Manager, and it's of type T. Actually, let me shorten that a bit. I'll call it DBMGR. I'll make it easier later on. That's of type T database manager. And I'll use a getter. And I'll make it read-only. Okay. And I'll come back and implement that in a second. I'll make it point at a private field. Okay, so let's implement my getter. So I'll say if my private field is not assigned, then I'll create it. And if you have a look, it takes as a parameter, well, it can take a few things. In a later exercise or a later session, we'll talk about the Mapping Explorer. But the main thing I want to talk about here is it takes an IDB connection interface. Now, because Aurelius can deal with lots of different data access technologies, it defines this interface called an IDB connection, and then gives you implementations of that interface for all the different data access technologies that it supports. So it provides an implementation for FireDAC, it provides an implementation for DB Express and for all the others. So I need to give it a FireDAC implementation of this DB connection. Yeah. So I'll create one just here. It's called from, what is it called? A T-FireDAC connection adapter. T-FireDAC connection adapter. Here, I've spelled that right. I'll create it. Okay. Now the constructor of this guy needs to know two things. It needs a connection, or it needs to point at my FireDAC connection, which is this component on my data module. Yeah. So I can just point that in. What's that called? CRM connection. And then in the version that I'm using, it just wants to know whether it owns that connection, whether it should be responsible for freeing that component or not. Now, because that component is actually owned by my data module, then I want to tell it, no, you're not responsible for freeing it. Yep, so I'll say false. If you had just created this dynamically in code, you could say true here, and then the FireDAC connection adapter would be responsible for destroying that connection. Okay. So I've created that. Oh, I better remember to free it. Sorry, not free it. Well, yes, I do have to free it in a second, but I also better remember to return it from my getter. Okay, that's not going to work very well if I don't do that. And while I'm at it, let's put an on destroy event of my data module. And just remember in here to call fdbmanager.free. Okay. So now on my data module, I can reference from my form, for example, I can get a reference to this database manager. Now, why would I want a database manager? This is the Aurelius object that I go to when I want to create the database from scratch the first time, or when I want to check and see if the database has all the right fields for the objects. You know, maybe I've added some fields to my objects or properties to my objects, and I want to validate at runtime that the database is correct, or even upgrade the database to support it. So that's what that guy's used for. Yeah. The other thing, so T-Database Manager you'll use quite a bit. The other object in Aurelius that you'll use, in fact, even more than a database manager, is a thing called an object manager. Now, the object manager is where you go to save one of your objects into the database, or where you go to query the database and load up a bunch of your objects. Yeah. So again, you can access this guy however you like. You can create them on demand, but an easy way, and what I'll use for this exercise, is to do kind of a similar thing as I did with the database manager. But on my form, I'm going to create a property called Object Manager, and it's of type T Object Manager. I'll create a getter, and again, it's a read-only property. Okay, I'll come back to that guy. I'll just create a private field to store it in. Okay, and in here, I'll do something awfully similar. If my F object manager, in this case, is not assigned, then I'll create it. TObjectManager.create. Okay. Now this guy also wants a reference to that DB connection. Yeah. But thankfully I can get it from my database manager. Yeah. So what's my data module called? DM main. So if I say DM main dot DB manager dot connection, I can now give it a reference to that same IDB connection interface that I was using in the other guy. Yeah, and again, I better remember to both return it, yeah, and also I better remember to free it as well. Okay, so I'll say what if object, actually, let's do this properly. I'll come back to this when we talk about saving later on, but first, if we're shutting down the form, I'll flush any unsaved changes out to the database, and then I'll say f object manager dot free. Okay, so a little bit of setting up, but now I've got a reference both to create my database and update my database through my DB manager, and I've also got an object I can use to save and load my classes into the database with my TObject manager. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the setting up. So it's not too bad. Yeah, you basically need a DB manager and an object manager. Now the other thing we need is some objects. Yeah, some business objects. I don't have any at the moment. So what I'm going to do is create a new unit, and I'll save it. I'll overwrite one that I've made before. Yep, replace that. Okay, so this is going to be my objects. I'm going to start out fairly simple. Let's create actually I didn't want to do that one. I never remember what this one's called. No parts. That's the one I want, class D. So this is going to be my T customer. It's not going to descend from anything. Yeah, and in fact that's one of the nice things that I really like about Aurelius is some object relational mapping tools that I've used in various languages need you to either descend your business objects from a particular class, so have them inherit from, I don't know, base object or something, or implement certain interfaces. But Aurelius is much more flexible on that. Your classes, your business objects can inherit from whatever you like, can inherit from TObject like this one if you want, and also don't have to implement any particular interface. Yeah, I'll show you what they do have to do in a second. But let's create our customer. Everything that I'm about to do in here is just plain old Delphi objects. They're not anything in particular to do with Aurelius. Yeah, and that's actually kind of nice. If you know how to create a class, create an object in Delphi, then you kind of know how to work with Aurelius. So let's create some basic properties on my customer. I'll come back later on and create some more so we can look at the process of updating the database. But for now, let me create, I should have a look at this. Yeah, I'll just do fields. Let me create one called name, which is a string. Let's create another one which is, what can it be? Oh, okay, I know. I'll create one called ACN. I'm in Australia. All companies in Australia have a thing called an Australian company number, so I'll create an ACN. It's also going to be a string. Okay, and then lastly, here is something that I need to do for Aurelius's benefit, is I need to tell Aurelius how to uniquely identify this customer. Now, you can do it in lots of different ways, but the default behavior is that Aurelius looks for an integer field called ID. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to do in this case. I'll create one called ID and I'll make it an integer. Okay. Now, you don't have to do that. You can, I'll come back to this when we talk about mapping, but you can change all of this. If you want your unique identifier for your classes to be GUIDs, for example, you can set that up. If you want it to have a composite field for the unique ID, you can set that up. But for this first example, for this simple example, I'm going to go with the default behavior in Aurelius. Yeah. So we've got our business object, and like I said, we'll come back later on and we'll add some other objects and create relationships between them. But for now, let's just run with our customer. Now, really at the moment, I haven't done anything Aurelius specific. Here's where I need to do some Aurelius specific thing. I need to use some attributes that Aurelius defines to tag my class with some information. Yeah. So the unit that these attributes are defined in is called Aurelius, and I always misspell Aurelius. I will no doubt do it at some point during this video. Okay. So in this unit called Aurelius mapping attributes, there's a bunch of attributes defined, but the minimum that I need to do is, first off, I need to tell Aurelius that this class, this customer class, is one that it needs to manage. It's responsible, okay, for loading it and saving it. So there's an attribute called entity. Okay, so by tagging it with that attribute, I'm basically telling it, okay, Aurelius, this is one of the entities that you need to manage. Yeah. The other thing is I can use one called auto mapping. Yeah, so this is kind of using all of the defaults for how Aurelius will map a class to the database. Yeah. Now, one of the nice things about Aurelius is that you can start with auto mapping and use the defaults for most of the properties in your class. But where you want to vary its behavior, you can just then dive in and tag that particular property with other attributes. Yeah. So rather than having to go through and specify for every single property what table you want to map to, what field you want it mapped to, whether it's required field or not, how long the string is, all that sort of stuff. You can kind of start by using the defaults and then just where necessary tag the extra attributes in. Now, I'll come back in a later session and we'll do some custom mapping. We'll alter the mappings a little bit. But as a simple example, I just want to start with this. And this is kind of what I mean by this sort of a gradual learning curve. You can start with this, start playing, and then as you want to tweak how it stores in the database, you can dive in and start tweaking just the things you need to customize. Okay, so I've got my objects. Let's actually start doing something in our form. Yeah. Now, I'm going to add a button. Actually, I'm going to add a couple of buttons, but let's add a button onto our form first. And what am I looking for? A caption. So I'm going to call this one Create DB. Okay. Now, you probably wouldn't have a button on your form called Create DB. You might do this in maybe in a little app that runs as part of your setup, or maybe you'd have it in the startup of your application, just checking that the database is there and creating it if it's not, or whatever. Yeah, but for the sake of this exercise, I'll stick it in a button. Yeah. So in here, what I want to do is use the database manager that's on my data module. So I'm going to say dm_main.db manager. Yeah. And then I'm going to say, the simplest one is just say build database. Yeah. If I'm starting from scratch and I have no database there, this is the simplest way to go. Yeah. If, for example, and I'll do this later on when I start changing the object model, adding extra properties, adding extra classes, that sort of stuff. The other one that you can do is call update database, where it actually looks at the structure of the database as it currently stands, looks at the structure of your objects, and identifies what it needs to change in the database in order to be able to save those objects. Yeah. So we'll do that later on, but for now I'm just going to say build database. Yeah. I didn't mention this before actually, but it's worth mentioning. In this particular scenario, I'm going to define my classes and tell Aurelius to create the structure needed to save it. But you can actually go the other way. If you've got an existing database, you can get Aurelius to generate the classes for you represented by that database. And this would be a nice way, if you're not dealing with a greenfield situation where you've got an existing database, maybe even an existing app, you can start bringing Aurelius, start using Aurelius in conjunction with the rest of your existing system. Yeah, but we'll look at that later on. So I've got my database, or I will have after I run it, and click Create DB. The other thing I'm going to do, just for the purposes of this demo, again, you'd probably have a nice form for creating customers. But inside this button, I'm just going to create a few customer objects. Yeah, and this will be the first place we actually get to see how you start interacting with Aurelius to save objects into the database. So this will be my create objects. Okay, in the onClick event, I'm going to create a local instance of my tCustomer. Now it probably won't know what my tCustomer is, so I'll have to use that unit that I created. Okay. Now, if you think about it, forget Aurelius for a second. If you were just going to create an instance of your component, of a class that you've got, what would you do? Well, you'd say something like that, and then you'd do something like lcustomer.name is equal to I don't know, Acme Proprietary Limited, and lcustomer.acn is equal to ABC123. Okay, so there's nothing there specific about Aurelius. Yeah. But now that I've created that customer, I want to save it into the database. Yeah, so this is where my object manager comes in. I say object manager.save, and it wants an entity. So I give it one. Okay, and I'm done. That's all you have to do. This is what I think is so cool about Aurelius. We had a little bit of setup to do, just creating our database manager and creating our object manager. But now I just start working with the objects. Yeah, and so if I create another one, probably should have copied and pasted that. Okay, and then again, just object manager, save. Okay, so there's probably a few of you watching this saying one of maybe a couple of things. Well, you might be saying lots of things, but let's narrow the scope a little bit. So first off, I didn't free this customer that I created up here. Yeah. One of the things you've got to get used to when you're dealing with Aurelius is that by saving an object, I'm essentially handing it over to Aurelius and saying, you're now responsible for this. Yeah. And so it will take care of when it creates that instance, when it destroys that instance. Yeah. So in general, there are times when you can take responsibility for an object away from Aurelius. Yeah. But kind of the default behavior when you query for a particular customer or a list of customers, you're not responsible for freeing them. Aurelius will take care of that. So we aren't doing anything else with this at the moment. Yeah. But let's save this and run it. And we'll come back and do more. And I want to stop at a couple of points during this and look at what we've got. Now let's just have a look at my monitor. Good, my app is connected. I can see I've got a client, excellent. And we should still have no tables in my database. Excellent. All right, so let's go back to my app. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is call createDB. Now remember, this isn't creating any of my customer objects, it's just creating the structure it needs in the database to store the customer object. Okay? So I won't click create objects yet. Let's first, actually let's come over here and refresh my view. And I should have a customer table, and it should have 3 fields at the moment: a name, an ACN, and an ID. But at the moment I haven't created any customers, so if I actually have a look in here, yeah, there's no records. Yeah. So let's keep going. Now I want to say create objects. This is where I'm creating the 2 customers. Yep. So if I click that, I should be able to go down to here and see, yep, here's the command that it's doing an insert into customer. Okay, it should be doing a couple of them actually. Yep, probably if we went, geez, I'm glad I turned off most of the tracing, because there's enough stuff in here to make it quite difficult to read. Anyway, you can come in here and have a look and see at the SQL that it's generating for you. But if we come back here and now view in here, we should see that I've got 2 records in here, one with an ID of 1, one with an ID of 2. And actually, in Interbase at least, it's probably created a generator for me, yeah, for generating those IDs. But again, that's just the default behavior. Like I said before, your ID doesn't have to be an integer. You can create different structures for your IDs, okay? But just think about that for a second. With actually not that much effort, we've set up the object relational mapping. All we're doing in our form code, there's basically no database logic in our form code. It's all business object logic. Yep. Closest we get is telling the object manager to save it. Yeah. Well, there's no SQL we're not writing any SQL. We're not iterating through the properties of our object and inserting them in as parameters in a query and inserting that into the database. Aurelius is doing all of that for us. Now, like I said, you can dive in and control how it does that at quite a level of detail, but we'll cover that in future sessions. Yeah. Let's stop this for the moment and let's do a little bit more, because just creating objects in a database isn't that interesting. Let's look at a couple of ways that we can get these objects back and do something with them. Yeah. So I'm going to drop, let me drop an edit box out. First way I'm going to look at is how to retrieve them when you know the ID. After that, we'll look at retrieving them when you don't know the ID. So this edit box is going to be my edit box for typing in the ID I want to retrieve. I'll also put out a label. Okay, I'll put that there, and I'll change the caption on this guy so that it says, I don't know, get by ID, something like that. Okay, So again, we want to just deal with the object. We don't want to deal with the database. We want to be thinking about the object. So I'll create a local variable to hold my T customer. Okay. And what I want to say is L customer is equal to, now I need to get it somehow. Yeah. Well, I go back to my object manager. So object manager dot find, okay, but this is a generic method. So I'm going to tell it, I want you to find a T customer for me. Yeah. And the ID of the customer that I want you to find is what's typed into edit1.text. Okay. Now it's possible it won't find it. Yeah. And so how do we deal with that? Well, if it doesn't find it, L customer will not be assigned. Yeah, the instance will be null. So I'll say if assigned L customer, then I'll put the name of the customer into the label. Label1.caption equals L customer dot name. Okay. So none of this data set field by name, none of this stuff. I just deal with the object. Yeah? And it's Aurelius's job to get it out of the database. Else, if it's not assigned, I'll just say label1.caption is equal to ID not found, something like that. Okay? Makes sense? Pretty easy, yeah? Again, and I love it because we're not dealing with databases. If I never have to write another bit of SQL in my life, it'll be too early. Okay, so I'm not going to create the database again. It's already created. I'm not going to create the objects again. They're already created. But let me get back object number 1. Okay, and there it is, Acme Proprietary Limited. Let's get back number 2. There it is. Okay, let's ask for one that doesn't exist. We go down the ID not found path. Yeah, really straightforward. What if you don't know the ID, or even differently, what if what you want to get back is not one customer, but a list of customers that match some criteria? Yeah, so let's do that. Let's add an edit box and add another button. And I'll do this a couple of different ways. The first way, I'll just use a list box, but then I'll come back in a little while and we'll use data-aware controls for this. So this one, let's call this get by name, I guess. Get by name, yeah. So, what are we going to do? Remember, this is one where I want to get back potentially a list of objects. So I'm not going to create a local customer. I'm going to create a local list of customers using the generic T-object list. Now I probably have to add, what's it in? Generics.collections. I think that's what it's called. Okay, so it knows about my T-object list. How do we get one? Yeah, well, again, we go back to our object manager. I'll say object manager dot find, and again, I'm interested in finding T customers. Sometimes you're not that helpful. Find T customer. Okay. Find my T customer, but I'm not going to specify this time an ID. I'm going to give it a set of criteria that I want it to match against. Yeah, so I'm basically going to do like a where clause, and that is the method that you use. You call where, and where takes some criteria. Yeah. Now there's a couple of different ways you can specify the criteria, but one that I like a lot and find very straightforward is actually based on sort of mimics the LINQ, language integrated query capabilities in .NET. So I need to add a couple of units to my users clause to do this. Just to do criteria in general, I need to add criteria.base, and then to use the LINQ features, the T-LINQ features, I use aurelius.criteria.link. Okay, oops, one would do. Okay, so let's go back down to my where clause. And here I'm going to use the T-LINQ class. And as you can see on here, it's got a whole bunch of different criteria functions that you can use. And in fact, you can sort of chain them together. But what I'm going to do is say contains, yeah? And now I need to give it a property name and a value. So I'm going to say where the name of my customer and the value I'm going to give it is what's in the edit box. Okay, so I'm basically saying find me the customers, find me T customers where the name, customer name contains what is in the edit box. Yeah, but what I want back is a list. So I'll tell it I want a list. Yeah. Now let me fold some of these down a little bit so it's a bit easier to read. I'm going to find my T customer where it contains, where the name contains what's in the edit box, and I'm going to get back a list. Yep, and I'm going to store that list in my lResult local variable. Okay. Now, what do I do once I've got a T object list of T customer? Well, there's a few things you can do. Later on, we will look at using live bindings. Probably in a future session, we'll look at using live bindings. But one of the cool things about live bindings is that you can bind a grid or a user interface element or whatever it is. You can bind a UI element to a list of objects. Yeah, exactly like this. So we'll do that in the future. But here I want to do two different things. First, I want to I'll just iterate over it and put the name into the list box. Yeah, but then I'll come back later on and we'll use a DB grid to do it as well. So what I'll say is, let's create another local variable. This one's going to be my L customer. And I'll say for L customer in L result do what will I do? Listbox dot add items dot add, and what I'll add is name. Okay, pretty straightforward, really. I think. So let's run it. We can still do my get by ID. Yep, 2, 1, fantastic. But let's do, oh, I know what I should do. I didn't clear the list box. So the second time we run this, it'll look a bit funny. But anyway, doesn't matter. Let's look for one that is contains an A, capital A. At the moment, I haven't told it to be case insensitive, so it's going to be case sensitive. So if I do get by name, it matches to Acme. Yeah. If I do a lowercase e, that will appear in both of them, but I have forgotten to put in the code to just clear this. So we should get added to this list. We'll get Code Partners and Acme, but this current Acme one will still be there as well. Yeah, there we go. Okay. What I probably should do is put in here this box1.clear. Okay. That's why you don't really want to be doing binding the hard way. Yep. Well, there's probably lots of reasons you don't want to do it the hard way. But anyway, so let's do E. Okay, awesome. Let's just do capital C. Fantastic. Yeah. Again, we've queried the database for things that are matching a certain criteria. We've got back a list, we've done something with that list. But you don't want to do this. You don't want to iterate over this to fill up user interface elements. What you really want to do is use, well, one of the things you might want to do is use a data set. Yeah. And fortunately, Aurelius comes with a T Aurelius dataset. Yeah, awesome. So let's add one of those guys, and then let's add a data source. So we'll connect our DB grid. Sorry, we better add a DB grid. So let's get rid of our list box. Let's add a DB grid. Okay. Let's connect it to our data source. Let's connect our data source to our data set, and let's change the code in here. So now listbox1 clear can go away. A few things can go away. Actually, all of this rubbish can go away. That can go away. And in fact, I'll get rid of that object list as well, but I'll do that in a second. What I want to do is I'll say Aurelius dataset1.close and Aurelius dataset1.open, but in between I basically want to feed my criteria here, yeah, effectively my object query. I want to feed that to the data set and say use this as the source of your data. Yeah. So I'm going to use set source criteria. Yeah. So it wants a criteria. Well, object manager.find.where actually gives me a criteria. So let's just tidy that up a little bit. Yeah, good enough. Just checking, double checking that, triple checking it. Okay, so I can lose all of this. I can lose all of this. That should be, if I haven't mucked it up, that should be all I need to do. Let's run it and see what I've mucked up. I always muck up something. So let's do one that should give us 2. Oh, I haven't mucked anything up, but let's have a look at what we've got in the grid here. So we've got ID and name and ACN. That's not surprising, but we got this weird field called self. Now this is a field that Aurelius inserts in there. And this, when we cover later on, when we look at doing list boxes and lookups, this self field will come into value, but we don't really want this right now. So how you can change what Aurelius will display, what this Aurelius dataset will display, again, it's pretty easy to guess how you do it. You create a field, a persistent field on your data set. Yeah. So let's add a new field. Sorry, am I doing this the right way? New field, sorry. What do I want in here? Let's just have the name for now. Field called name. It's of type string, and it's a data field. Yep. So that's all I want. So if I run this now, I should be able to say, just have the name for my things. If I wanted, in fact, I'll come back later on and add some extra fields here because you can get tricky. You can actually display fields in here that are from a relationship. So later on when I add contacts or orders or some other relationship to my T-customer object, in here I could have a field that's saying, you know, my customer dot, the contacts property on my customer dot name or something like that. But we'll cover that later on. Okay, let's tidy this up a little bit. So far I think that's pretty cool. Yeah, we've with not too much setup, we've created a some objects, saved them into the database. We've done some querying against the database, and we've used this Aurelius data set to bind the results coming back from that query into our user interface. Yet our code in here, there's no real database code. It's all object code. Yeah. So I think this is really nice. Yeah. All of the business logic can live in my business objects, in my customers, in my orders, that sort of stuff. My UI logic can stay in my forms. There's nice clean separation between where the logic for these things live. Yeah. Now, that's all great, but you've got to admit my object model's pretty basic. Yeah. So let's make it less basic.